Hello again, welcome to our afternoon session here today. You're very welcome at the West Cork History Festival. My name's David Clark and I am here for the sole reason that I'm a friend of Simon Kingston's again. I think that's quite a lot of people today have been tapped on the shoulder and asked to help out. What makes me different is I'm not actually related to Simon, unlike half the people here, although my wife is. Without further ado, we're just going to get on with here. We have Dr. Andrew Bielenberg, a senior lecturer from University College Cork, and he's going to be talking about spies and informers in West Cork. It's a very sensitive topic. There's a lot of issues, I suppose, that go with this topic about the rights and wrongs and the morality of war, and what happens to men when they engage in war. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Andrew Bielenberg.
Thank you for the invitation, Simon. I just want to make the point, as I'm starting, that this paper is about all Cork, right? Not just West Cork, all Cork, but it certainly includes West Cork. The research arises out of a project on conflict-related fatalities during the War of Independence in all of County Cork, all conflict-related fatalities on all sides. And that research is being done with Professor Jim Donnelly, based in Wisconsin. And it's an online project, and the results can be found at the Irish Revolution website, UCC Cork Examiner website. It's very much a work in progress. It's a public engagement project. We're getting a lot of feedback from the public, correcting us, mostly friendly, some hostile, it has to be said. And criticism has certainly helped to improve the project considerably. Now, this was preceded by the Cork Spy Files project, and in this project we identified 78 suspected spies and informers in all of County Cork who were killed during the War of Independence. And in this project now, on the fatality index on which this is based now, what I'm talking here today, we have narrowed this down and we've taken out the less documented cases. We've taken out one case, somebody who was killed actually on the Kerry border, and it looks like on the Kerry side, so we've taken that person out. We have to be precise. And nobody attacked us on that one, funnily enough, even though it was on the spy files for many months. And there was also another case of somebody who died in IRA custody, so technically the IRA had not killed them. So we took them out as well. Most of these 71 cases are mentioned in multiple sources. And our fatality index has been built up from a whole matrix of these sources. And of course, although espionage of its nature leaves many unanswered questions, our main objective has been to construct a framework in which individual cases add up to a composite picture. So we're trying to improve the analysis of this group of people, almost perhaps from a sociological perspective. And this we hope will add to our understanding and move things on a little bit. And this enables us, for example, to examine the amount of killings in each month over the course of the War of Independence. I thought I would have a PowerPoint, but I'm going to have to articulate my PowerPoint charts and things, so I'll have to talk you through some of the findings. Now, this reveals, in terms of the numbers killed per month, no spies were killed in 1919. The first spy, suspected spy, Timothy Quinlisk was killed in February in 1920. Then there's a lull till the summer of 1920. But then really from the autumn of 1920, the intensity, the killing starts to rise. And then it rises again in 1921. Things go up dramatically. And basically the peak months when spies and informers are killed are February, March, and May in 1921. So there's basically an intensification of killing of spies and informers in this particular month, in these months and in this period. And in fact, from the beginning of 1921 to the truce in July 1921, 86% of the spies were killed in these 6 months. So it's important to understand that the vast majority of these killings took place in the final 6 months of the War of Independence, when British military intervention, as opposed to the police, this is the period when British military intervention in the conflict and indeed its intelligence capacity peaked in this period. And this was in the period when the IRA killed most spies and informers. 86% were killed after January 1921 down to the truce. Now, who were these suspected spies and informers killed by the IRA? Now, our data is good, contrary to some claims in the press that's try to denigrate the data. These are not samples. These are not guesstimates. These are actual people killed. And I think we've got most of them on our database. So this is a good way, a good basis to assess who these people were. And it's been possible to gather information on the occupations of a number of them, most of them. And this reveals they came from right across the social spectrum, but more came from working class backgrounds. More came from working class backgrounds, and well over half from the poorer end of the social spectrum. So there's a greater number at the bottom of the social pile, if you like, in income terms. So for those who were guilty, at least, some of these people were probably vulnerable to cash blandishments from British forces, despite the major risks that entailed. And it should be remembered that 1920-21 witnessed a major economic downturn in Ireland. There was a big crash in Ireland in 1920 and 21. And of course, the War of Independence itself deranged parts of the economy. It was hard, cash was hard come by. There was a recession. And of course, unemployment was a growing problem, not least among ex-servicemen. 50% of ex-servicemen were unemployed at this time. 50% of ex-servicemen were unemployed. There was also a smaller group higher up the social spectrum. Managers, some larger farmers, etc., who were also targeted. Now, of course, these people were more likely to have been motivated by patriotic loyalism. But I'd like to say that I think such loyalism, it needs to be understood that this loyalism, both among Catholics and Protestants, existed also lower down the social scale. And I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to come back to that nearer the end of the paper. Now, of course, a critically important issue in this whole area is the question of guilt or innocence. Now that's an issue that's much harder to establish than the other things we can establish: occupations, religion, so forth. And we can't adjudicate in black and white terms on that at this point, but certainly the more evidence that we can gather from both sides, from the British side, from the Irish side, from the nationalist side, all of that can only improve the picture. So certainly there's room for improvement there, but I think we have been improving it, and we're further down the road now, but we still can't make clear judgments on that particular issue of guilt or innocence at this stage. We have some preliminary views on it, obviously, but as it stands, our profiles, I don't think our profiles would support Peter Hart's contention that the great majority of suspected spies and informers were innocent, or that most of these killings had little to do with espionage. We can see enough, I think, to say that I would be surprised if our picture swings things back to Peter Hart's position. I think I could say that much, at least, from what we can see from the data at the moment. And people might have very different judgments. The stuff is out there. It's online. Other people might reach very different judgments, but it's out there. All of you can read it online. Now, his conclusion in this respect, I think, depends too much on a British military assessment. And that assessment was based particularly on 1 month, February 1921, and that was, of course, the peak months for deaths for the entire conflict, both of all deaths, of all people, police, military, civilians, but also spies and informers. February 1921 was the peak month for deaths in the conflict. Now, while Hart did augment this by evidence in a number of other cases, in a few other cases, I think that was inadequate to make the kind of assessment, the firm assessment that he has made, that the majority were innocent and all of this most of them had nothing to do with espionage. We certainly couldn't agree with that particular assessment. Now, I want to turn now to the gender imbalance in those killed. That's fairly striking. There's a taboo about killing women on all sides in the War of Independence, and far fewer were killed in the conflict at large. Of the far greater number suspected of informing, a much larger number of suspects were women. Most these were generally dealt with by the IRA in a different way. Exile was the common way. Hair bobbing sometimes earlier on, perhaps, but exile more commonly for women. They had to leave the country, leave the district. And the two episodes where women were killed as suspected spies and informers in County Cork both gave rise to investigations within the IRA in which it was apparent that IRA GHQ was not at all approving of these killings. There was particularly the notorious case of Mary Lindsay. Eve Morrison talked earlier about Bridget Noble, so I'm not going to go over that case again. But, of course, Mary Lindsay, an elderly woman, intervened in an attempt to stop bloodshed on both sides in the abortive Dripsey ambush in 1921. And the IRA's position was thus revealed, and they suffered a number of casualties and imprisonments, and ultimately 5 executions. The IRA version here was that Mrs. Lindsay and her chauffeur were held as hostages. She had passed information to the British, resulting in multiple executions, and they were both shot as a subsequent reprisal for these having been guilty of informing. The British knew that they passed information on to the British that if the IRA volunteers were executed, she would be shot. The executions took place, and indeed they were both killed. Now the bodies, or I should say, in these cases, in this case, Clark, the chauffeur, was certainly one of those who was entirely innocent, even by IRA standards. And I think we have to say that revolutionary justice, and indeed military justice, British military justice, meted out by both sides, was certainly ruthless, uncompromising, and at times inhuman. The bodies, particularly in that respect, the bodies of those executed by the British Army were never returned to the relatives, and indeed they now are buried in the grounds of UCC. And of course, Mrs. Lindsay and her chauffeur, as far as we know, their bodies were never recovered either. And these two were among 24 of the 71. 24 of the 71 suspects we're talking about here were killed and disappeared secretly by the IRA. They were buried, and in many cases, in most cases, their bodies haven't been recovered. Now, I wish to turn to some of the core implications and findings of this research. And here we have to turn to the historiography. And Peter Hart's The IRA and Its Enemies undoubtedly had a very strong influence in shaping the debate around this whole issue. And his final chapter is on this subject of spies and informers killed in Cork over the period of the Revolution. But our view is that the reception of this book, and perhaps even to some extent some of its conclusions in this regard, have been strongly shaped by the immediate aftermath of the Northern Troubles. And in this, sectarianism, and particularly the question of sectarianism, figures particularly largely. But unsurprisingly, after almost 2 decades now, Peter published his work. Almost 2 decades, it's hard to believe, but almost 2 decades have gone since this book came out. And some of his findings on spies and informers certainly require significant qualification and revision at this point if we confront the new evidence that our database has turned up. Now, one of Hart's core conclusions in his final chapter on spies and informers, right near the end of the book, was that, and I quote Peter Hart, "Looking over the whole span of the revolution in County Cork, we can see that the main themes of the West Cork massacre," this was in April 1922, the Dunmanway massacre as it's sometimes known. We can see that the main themes of the West Cork massacre conspiracy theories, land, and sectarian vengeance were prefigured in the executions of informers carried out in the previous 2 years. Okay? So this conclusion that sectarianism was already strongly evident in the killing of suspected spies and informers in County Cork from early 1920 has not been borne out by our research. Our findings indicate in very simple terms that of the suspected spies and informers killed by the IRA in County Cork during the War of Independence, 69% were Catholic. 69% of those killed by the IRA were Catholic. And that certainly does not support Hart's sectarian contention. Now, part of the problem with his analysis of spies and informers, suspected spies and informers, I should say, for the whole revolutionary period, notably his comparative table of suspects, victims, and actual informers. He gathered data on all three of these categories: suspects, those killed, and actual informers. But the problem with this data is it comes from different periods during the revolution. The revolution, when we talk about the revolution, we generally talk about 1916 or 1919 up to 1923, after the Civil War. And this, in other words, his table, this breakdown of these three categories, doesn't compare like with like, because the War of Independence, the Truce, and the Civil War are three very distinct phases in the revolution. They weren't all the same. It's important not to aggregate them. The fatality profiles are different in each. And that's important for the analysis. So if we want to analyze this stuff, we need to look at these three things separately. Certainly we can look at make an overview, but we also need to be conscious of what's going on in the War of Independence, the Truce, and the Civil War. So this is a technical issue in handling the data. But from the way Hart presents his data, he concludes that Protestants, ex-soldiers, and those described as tinkers or tramps, so he puts these group all together in one group. This group made up 14% of informants, 27% of suspects, and fully 67% of those shot. Ex-soldiers, Protestants, tramps, tinkers. This group accounted for 67% of those shot. So we have looked at this slightly differently. With the new data we have generated, we can take Hart's suspect table, those suspected, which comes from the War of Independence, and we can compare that evidence to our evidence of those actually killed in the War of Independence. In other words, we can take two compatible sets of data and compare them, and we're comparing like with like. And the results of this indicate that those higher up the social spectrum accounted for a higher share of suspects and a lower share of victims. Okay? Those higher up the social spectrum accounted for a higher share of suspects and a lower share of those actually shot. Conversely, those lower down the social spectrum had a lower share suspected and a higher share who were actually shot. So that's an important finding, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit more and push the analysis a little bit further. Now, if we break down our data geographically into the 3 brigade areas, this also reveals some very different outcomes across the different brigade areas. And this is important also, I think, for the analysis. The most notable outcome here of this differentiation reveals that the Cork 1 Brigade killed far more suspects. 43 out of the 71 were killed in the Cork 1 Brigade area. So 61% of the victims, in other words, were in the Cork 1 Brigade area. And this brigade, the Cork 1 Brigade, invested a lot more in intelligence gathering than the other brigades. It's evident that they put a lot more effort into intelligence gathering. Of course, they had more opportunity to do so because, of course, Cork City was the nerve centre of the British military complex and indeed the naval base for Ireland, for the south of Ireland, I should say. So they fully exploited that source of information, both inside the barracks, outside the barracks, in different battalions, different companies. They invested a lot. Undoubtedly, they sometimes got it wrong. If you collect a lot of information, sometimes you get wrong information. And clearly, some of these people were innocent and should never have been killed. That is clear. But I think Hart has gone too far in suggesting that the IRA usually got it wrong. Okay. Yet his assessment that the most dangerous informers were those who were in or close to the IRA, that stands up pretty well. Certainly some of the most damaging leaks of information through spies were of people in or very close in, almost volunteers. These caused the biggest damage in terms of volunteer casualties, IRA casualties, as a result of intelligence on the British side. Hart, however, underestimates somewhat the damage that civilian neighbours could do to the IRA. They didn't need a lot of technical knowledge about the IRA or operations or anything, but they needed to be able to identify who was in the IRA. That was the key thing. So neighbours who lived in the locality in particular companies, they could identify IRA members. It was vital for the survival of the IRA that they avoid detection. Now, when we map out, I was hoping to show you a map of all the killings in County Cork. And if we map it out, broadly speaking, the killing of suspected spies and informers conforms to the wider killing of civilians across County Cork. But geographically, there is a notable zone to the south of the city where there is a slightly higher concentration. This would be the operational area of the 2nd Battalion, Cork 1 Brigade. This covered basically the south side of Cork City. This carried out more of the city killings. And we think that a lot of the bodies of these suspects were buried in the suburbs of Cork City, to the south in the countryside, down now around where the airport is now, Ballygarvan, back across to Passage, and that whole crescent, if you like, around the south of the city suburbs at the time. Tory Top Lane, Ballyfeehan, a lot of this area would have been countryside, of course, at this point in time. And this is the area where many of these civilian suspects were buried. Now, of course, why did they disappear people? Most were not disappeared. They were left tagged, spies and informers, beware, those who associate with the auxiliaries in the RIC, and so on. This was the case with most, but the disappearances, the advantage of the disappearances for the IRA was it reduced the possibility of reprisals. But on the other hand, of course, when you tag people, this was widely reported the next day in great detail, gory detail in the press, and this had a greater deterrent effect on the population in terms of passing information. So the message was very clear. This, if you inform, this is what will happen to you. And of course, this is a terror tactic, which was fundamentally important to the survival of the IRA, to avoid detection. Now, one of the most notable findings of our research, I think, was the relatively higher number of ex-soldiers killed than in other studies, than in Hart's study. O'Halpin's published his preliminary findings. I think our findings indicate there are more ex-soldiers amongst the suspects. We found that ex-soldiers accounted for 36 of the 71 civilian suspects killed by the IRA in Cork during the War of Independence. Now, if we include ex-sailors and ex-RIC, so we incorporate all Crown forces, if you like, then the number rises to 40 out of 71. 40 out of 71, or 56% of our total were ex-Crown forces. So this, in our view, this prior connection with Crown forces was by far the most notable feature of those targeted, rightly or wrongly, by the IRA in the War of Independence. And Protestants constituted a tiny share of this particular group. 6 out of the 40 ex-Crown forces, 6 were Protestants. So in short, this targeted group was most certainly not a story about sectarianism, okay? It was certainly not a story about sectarianism. Now, we need to move to West Cork. It gets worse from here on in. So the only area where the Protestant share of victims is high is in the West Cork Brigade area, where they accounted for 56% of fatalities. In West Cork, Protestants accounted for 56% of fatalities. But it's important to point out here, despite impressions from guerrilla days in Ireland and so on, West Cork wasn't all that significant in the overall profile of those killed. West Cork accounts for a smaller share of fatalities. What we were talking about here is 10 Protestant suspect victims in all 1920 and 21. We're talking about 10 people, okay? Now, if for the sake of argument and we might have one or two here today. If we assume that half were guilty, then we'd be down to 5 people in West Cork. But that still doesn't mean they might have been innocent. It doesn't mean they were killed for sectarian reasons. So what we've got to do, I think, is we need to examine these cases in West Cork on a case-by-case basis. And I'm sure this will happen. We've already got a certain amount posted up on our database. Others will have other evidence, new evidence. But we can look at all these cases in detail and sort out this issue. But when this small number is analysed in the wider context of all deaths in the War of Independence, 528 deaths in County Cork during the War of Independence on all sides, civilians, police, army, and volunteers. I think it's hard to see the sectarian thesis getting any real traction with regard to the killing of spies and informers. I don't see that happening. So the onus is very much on those who are pushing this thesis, and there's some people pushing it very hard. They need to provide more widely based evidence rather than simply asserting it and referring to Peter Hart. That's not good enough anymore. You need to come up with the evidence, and that debate must proceed on the basis of evidence. In Cork 1 Brigade, where the majority of suspects were killed, 75% were Catholics in the Cork 1 Brigade area. There is simply no basis for the sectarian argument here, or indeed in North Cork. And I'm talking here about most of the county, where most of the spies and informers were killed. So taking the county as a whole, the sectarian thesis is simply a non-runner. I think Hart has read too much into the Dunmanway massacre in April 1922, which followed during the truce period subsequently. And Hart assumed wrongly that the killings in the preceding 2 years could also simply be categorised as a sectarian precursor to that event. And I think that that argument doesn't stand up when you set it against the evidence we now have. Hart's focus on West Cork has reiterated the overemphasis in the historiography on West Cork since the publication of Tom Barry's Guerrilla Days in Ireland in the late 1940s. A more balanced assessment of events in Cork needs to focus on the revolution right across the county, more particularly in the Cork 1 Brigade area, where the bulk of suspected spies and informers were killed. So in moving forward, and I think it's time to move forward. We've been bogged down with this stuff, the sectarian thing, because of the fallout from the Northern Troubles, and we need to move on from that. We've got a blinkered perspective. We need to get beyond that and look at the War of Independence in its own right. And we need to go back to the actual War of Independence evidence and look more closely at the significance of the British military complex in Irish society at the time, and it was very significant. It had long been the largest heading of British state expenditure in Ireland through the 19th century. State expenditure was obviously much lower, but much more of it was going into the British military complex. And because of this quiet working class and middle class loyalism among both Catholics and Protestants connected with that military complex, this was significant in County Cork. Cork was a major centre of the British military and naval complex. And that, I would say, what I call quiet loyalism would have been underpinned by service in the British forces during the First World War. That would have further underpinned that quiet loyalism. And it's no coincidence that the neighbourhood around Victoria Barracks, now Collins Barracks, this is where I live, me and my family, on the north side of Cork City. This neighbourhood, which contained the barracks and also contained 4 RIC barracks, this was regarded at the time as the most hostile area to the IRA in all County Cork. And this comes from IRA testimony, which I want to cite to you. It's a witness statement from Sean Healy, who was captain of the A Company in the 1st Battalion on the north side. And he says, a large percentage of the people in the area had connections with British forces and police. Vested interests had been established over the years. Shopkeepers were handling big military contracts. The soldiers and police had intermarried with the citizens. In fact, 90% of the residents in our area could be regarded as definitely pro-British. Okay? This isn't British testimony. It's not a loyalist household. Exaggerating. This comes from a volunteer. 90% of the residents in our area could be regarded as definitely pro-British and hostile to the IRA. Okay? Now, similar sentiments could evidently be found on the south side of the city. Also in the British garrison towns across the county, around the naval and coast guard installations and the major RIC bases. Now, this is a minority perspective, a minority view, but what I'm saying is it was there. It was not totally insignificant, and it was there. And what's abundantly clear from our research is that the IRA believed on the information they were going on, good or bad, that ex-Crown forces was the most important networks being exploited for gathering information to be used against them during the War of Independence. And this is reflected in whom they targeted and killed, more so than whom they suspected. The suspects were different to those who they actually killed, and it's important to make that distinction. And the core finding, I'm going to finish up now, the core finding of our research is that the most typical type of suspected of spy and informer killed by the IRA in the War of Independence were not Protestant farmers killed for agrarian or sectarian reasons, but working class Catholic ex-soldiers. This is the biggest group of spies and informers killed by the IRA during the War of Independence. So, in terms of killing, I think it's fair to say that the conflict in Cork was certainly a fairly dirty campaign on both sides. And the high level of documented disappearances, both of civilians, which I've talked about, and indeed Crown forces, the particularly high level in County Cork. This is an example of that Cork, the campaign in Cork, was certainly at the extreme end of the spectrum relative to other counties in terms of the adoption of those tactics. But our profile of suspected spies and informers killed by the Cork IRA, while we would accept that the campaign was a dirty one, during the War of Independence, it certainly does not support the contention that the IRA campaign was a sectarian one. Our evidence is good enough now on that question, on the question of religion. That does not support the contention that the IRA campaign in County Cork was a sectarian one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bielenberg. I'm sure you'll agree that was a fascinating, very analytical discussion, but also a very clear conclusion there at the end. We've got obviously some time for questions, so can we have, is there anybody looking to ask some questions at all? Sorry, the gentleman at the back. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thanks for that anyway. With this kind of stats-based approach, I guess, the general profile of the victims, whatever you want to term them, one thing I noticed in the ream of stats that you give out, and you seem to, I don't know if it was just you didn't mention it today or whether it's in your research or writing, but I didn't hear about it. But one stat that I'd be interested in is the actual population, the relative religious makeup of the population. In, for example, I think it was 6 out of 40 in South Cork City who were Protestant. But unless you marry that up with the religious makeup of that community, you're not really telling the full story there, whether the minority population was picked on, essentially.
Yeah, okay, so I can't go into the breakdown of different parts of the county, but I think what you're driving at, what I'm going to say probably bears out what you're saying, your point, and that is that if we take County Cork as a whole, 31% of the victims were Protestant, right? But Cork only, the Protestant population in County Cork was only 10%. Is that the point you're making? Right, made it for you. Okay, my response to that is that obviously the group you're looking at, who are in many cases loyal, we've got to remember that there are many Catholic loyalists, the loyalist population in Cork, from which some spies are drawn, Catholic spies and informers, that if we look at the loyalist population, obviously the Protestants are going to be overrepresented in that, okay? And this accounts for that disparity. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. The gentleman over there. And can I just say, it'd be great if we had some questions from ladies. We're having lots from men, but it'd be nice to have some women speaking as well.
Okay, just do three things. One is that gentleman has taken my question, and Andy's answer is about the general split within Cork, religious split. The second point to mention, I was at a conference last week in Maynooth, which was to a considerable extent, if you like, the ghost of Peter Hart was there too. And I think we have to remember that Peter was, in a sense, the first in this field. He was the first to interrogate many of these sources which we now use, and we all follow his footnotes and so on. Now, some people obsessively follow his footnotes in hope of correcting them, but by and large, Hart, whatever his arguments, for example, about ethnic cleansing and so on, but he was an extraordinary historian who did an extraordinary amount of good research and put it out there. And I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with that. Second thing is a general question. I mean, you made the point indirectly, Andy. As you know, I published what I thought was my guesstimate, if you like, based on an insular survey of the killing of civilian spies and informers between 1919 and 1921. Of which almost all happened in 1920 and 21. But I mean, the point about Cork, and we can differ about the numbers in Cork, you know, within reason. I don't think we differ that much. But what's amazing in Cork, as compared, for example, with Dublin, which is, after all, the centre of the revolution, or compared with Antrim, which is really Belfast, which is the third most violent place as measured by fatalities. Like Cork is by far the most violent place, but proportionately, the number of those in Cork who die, who are killed because they're allegedly informers, is so much higher than it is in Dublin, where, after all, you have the underground government, where you had GHQ and so on. And it's infinitely higher in a sense than in Belfast, because there doesn't seem to be a single informer killed in Belfast in those years. So there's a question about the comparative, which is why I urge people, in a sense, in relation to other counties, to do precisely what you're doing, right? So that we get a clearer picture. But the difficulty is that the difficulty may be that as historians from different not different institutions, but different counties, we may, in a sense, end up rushing to the defence of our county or whatever. What we need to do is look at this nationally. Thank you.
Okay. That's what you're doing, I believe, Ewan, and maybe my figures will contribute to your composite picture in the end. Yes, many more were killed in Cork. Many more died in Cork. Many more fatalities died. 20% of all fatalities in the War of Independence were in Cork. So the intensity of the conflict was greater in this county, and it was one of the centres of the revolution. I think more people were killed in Cork than in Dublin. That Dublin was the centre. I don't know if everyone here would agree with you there, Ewan, but I'm not going to go there. In terms of Peter Hart, yes, of course, Peter was one of the pioneers of this area. Unfortunately, we tend to look at a couple of issues in the book ad nauseum. We forget that a number of chapters in the book have stood up really well in terms of time. 4 or 5 of the chapters are absolutely excellent, and much of his analysis is still good. He, as you say, he brought a range of new sources, and we are much indebted to his work as a historian. But 20 years have gone by, and now we need to look at new evidence. There is new evidence coming through.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Let me just say, in relation to Peter Hart, I mean, I'm not a specialist Irish historian. I specialise in Russian and Soviet history, but to me, Peter Hart's book is one of the first book is one of the best pieces of history ever written. It's certainly in my top 10 history books. Andy, so your argument is the killings weren't sectarian in the sense that they weren't killed because they were Protestants, or weren't killed for kind of ethnic type reasons. Okay, fair enough. But the picture you sketched to me is that why they were killed, or why there was a pattern of killings, is because they were loyalists, or they were perceived to be unionists. So isn't what you're describing a picture of political sectarianism, a pattern of murder motivated by political sectarianism, if not religious sectarianism?
No. They're targeted because they're suspected of parsing information. Now, certainly in cases where they got that wrong, you know, obviously then question marks arise. But the cases, the reasons they were targeted, if you look at our database, you can see from an IRA perspective why they were carrying out those killings in the majority of cases, I would say, a majority being 51%. No, I don't think the IRA was setting about killing loyalists or killing Protestants. I don't think that's what it was about. And I think that this is the influence of the Northern Troubles in this whole analysis, that we've got to move on from that. That's not where it's at.
Okay, I'm terribly sorry to say we seem to be running out of time now, because if you want to get down to the next session down at the Secret Garden, which is Finola Finlay talking about Tower Houses of West Cork, that is going to start in a few minutes now. But all I can say now is thank you very much to Dr. Bielenberg. Thank you very much for all your questions, and please join me again in thanking Dr. Bielenberg.
Thank you.